Hi, it's Mark Cooper-Smith from UC Berkeley and my ongoing series of videos about startups and entrepreneurship and some of the resources that you can use and some of the insights that you can use to do a better job at it. I'm here right now with José Cayasso, or Caya, from Slidebean. Caya, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Mark. Nice to meet you.
Yeah. So Caya is a founder and has been through this process of raising funding, of putting together pitch decks and all of that. But more importantly, Kaya's put together with Slidebean a platform to help entrepreneurs develop that first pitch deck and then grow their business. So Caya, can you tell us a little bit about kind of your story and the Slidebean story?
Yeah, so I'm originally Costa Rican, and then I came to the States the first time when I was, well, as a startup founder back in 2012. We did an accelerator there. And this was like a crash course for me on how startups worked, because I really did not understand it. I did not come from this background, and there wasn't a big startup scene down in Costa Rica back then. And yeah,
back
that
then
company failed.
Back then was how long ago? 10 years ago?
No, that's 2012, so 8 years ago.
Yeah, 8 years
the scene
ago.
is still small, but growing. But that company went out of business. We failed at raising capital. But then, as I was kind of giving up on that product and business, we came up with this concept for presentations. Like, how can we make presentations easier? I'm a graphic designer, and I hate bad PowerPoints. I hate spending so much time on PowerPoint. So, like, how could we solve this?
Right.
Long story short, it's very hard to compete against PowerPoint as a broad presentation product that sort of a lot of people can use for a lot of different purposes. But we ended up with a niche audience of other startup founders that were finding our platform useful for their pitch decks. So we've been doubling down on that ever since.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, one of the key things, one of the things that you said right there, which is really important to me, is some of the greatest insights, some of the greatest launches of companies come from those problems that founders have that are right in front of them. And that's what you were talking about, right? I mean, it was like, look, you didn't like the option that you had, so you went looking for some alternatives. And if I were to fast forward, you ended up creating your own. Is that right?
Yeah. And I am a big believer in this as the thesis for a business, right? I see a lot of people that try just to start a business because they're tired of their jobs.
Right.
But no, I think that the idea should be like, I'm an expert in this area. I see that it's not being solved well. I have a better solution. Let's build it out.
Right. No, that's exactly been my experience, especially the ones for me that have worked particularly well are areas where I'm involved. I'm out looking for a better solution and I can't find it. And I go, there's got to be a better solution. And after I've turned over all the stones in my area of expertise, sometimes I finally said, I'm just going to go build one. And those are the ones that are successful. Exactly.
Yeah.
So what is Slidebean? Tell us a little bit about Slidebean. Kind of how long has it been around? What does it do? You're actually really kind of reframing what it does. Just give us a little bit about from its genesis to now and where you're going with it.
Yeah. We're in that evolution process. But like I said, we started as a presentation platform. We wanted to make the process of building slides simpler. And our thesis here was the problem with PowerPoint or Prezi or Canva or any of those is that you're getting, what you get in front of you is a canvas, a white canvas, and you need to pour your company into this canvas or whatever you want to talk about. But that's a twofold process. You're thinking of what the content is, and at the same time you're figuring out how that's going to be arranged in the slide. And graphic designers can maybe get away with that, but most people can't. Most people, it's a distraction. You're trying to figure out what to put in there, but at the same time you're figuring out if you're choosing the right font or if it's the right size. So that's just distracting, and we still believe that's one of the reasons why people hate PowerPoint, because it's the tedious process. So what we did as a thesis for Slidebean is separate these two. We give people an interface where they just add their content, that's words and images, but they're not arranged. You're not thinking about how it's going to look. It's just the content. And then on the other side, we take that content and we arrange it automatically. First, we did it with some rules. Now we do it with AI. But that was the initial premise.
So let me break in with just a second, if I might, because I want to tug on that a bit. So when you think about putting a pitch together, you've got the story that you tell and how you tell it.
That's right.
Right. So, and those are two different things. It sounds like you started with a little bit of how you tell it, how do you present it, whatever else it is, with an understanding of, I'm going to tell my story. But The way that you've continued to evolve the product, and you were just touching on, well, now we help use, we use some AI, we do some other elements to help probably do a better job with some of the underlying content. Help us understand how that works.
Yeah, so this premise of people spending more time than they should on a platform like PowerPoint is based on, I mean, that applies to pretty much every presentation, right? And a presentation a professor would use, or a sales deck, like, and we originally thought of Slidebean as a platform that could solve or simplify presentations for pretty much any purpose. The problem was that you just can't reach all the markets at the same time. We couldn't, and then we started seeing a lot of people from the startup community starting to use Slidebean for their pitch deck specifically. We had a few templates out there, but it was not our priority by any means. We were too broad, and then these guys started becoming a majority of our customers. So we doubled down on them on features, we doubled down on them on templates, we doubled down on them on marketing, because this audience was working, retention was good, NPS scores were good. They were happy with the product. You could call this product market fit. I don't know if that's what it is yet, but we could call that.
But that part of that is you saw people in particular using Slidebean for certain areas, right? So
right.
It's like if people are using it, and especially if they're willing to pay for it, that's a pretty good initial indicator.
That's right. So we doubled down on them, but by doing this, we found out two things. One, we had imagined this company that would have hundreds of millions of users using us for presentations. But then the reality is there aren't hundreds of millions of startup founders that we can reach.
Right.
So if we still wanted to build the large company that we set out to build, something had to change. We either had to go pursue our other audiences, which is a valid approach, or double down on these with different products. And that's what we ended up concluding. And it took us years to come to this conclusion, because it meant, in a way, giving up on the presentation only platform, which is what we set out to build, right? And saying, well, we built this, it's good, but it's just not big enough. It's not going to grow to where we want it to grow. So giving up on this, meaning, we're carving out part of the team to build other products, to build other things that we could also sell to these guys. And it took us a while. Maybe I think I was the first one to sort of come to this conclusion maybe a year and a half ago. My co-founders, they're product people, so they're in love with their baby product Slidebean, and it took them a little longer. But I think we all got in line maybe 6 months ago, and we started sort of pushing in the same direction, which is we have the audience now, and YouTube is a big part of that. In which other ways can we help these guys, and of course monetize them?
Yeah, well, and that's just as an entrepreneur. I mean, the first challenge, of course, is to getting somebody to try and buy your product. But the next challenge, the way you build a scalable business, is to get them to keep using your product and to keep paying for your product, and even better, to tell their friends and their colleagues to use your product and start paying for it. So it sounds like, as you're telling your story, you had people that were buying your product, but they were using it for a specific thing, kind of the pitch.
That's right.
And they didn't need you anymore. At least not for 18 months, until they had to go out and do it again. And then they would come back. But what happened to the revenue model in the interim? So now you're looking to go ahead and expand it. In what ways are you expanding your platform right now?
So the first thing we found was that I think we've done a good job at marketing. Content marketing has been our strength. That's the way we met, and that's. I know.
I'm going to come back to that. Some of the great videos. Exactly.
So we started establishing Slidebean, and inevitably myself as a expert in this. I don't want to say guru, because that's a bad word in the YouTube world, but an expert in the matter, right? And people started coming to us, and they were coming to our platform and saying, well, no, I don't want to use your platform. I want you guys to help me with my deck. But how? No, like, design it for me. Like, well, but here's this platform that we built for you. It does the design. It uses AI to do it for you. No. Like, I want a human being to do a design for me, because this is a very important deck.
Right. And in between, by the way, you're probably saying, no, scalable business models. Here's the platform. Pay me for that.
That's right.
I can't design everybody's deck and make that fundamentally scalable. Yeah.
Yeah. And we turned these guys away for years, these leads. Right. Until one day we said, okay, let's do it. Let's see what happens. So we built another business around that, which we called Slidebean Agency, which is a human being consulting design agency, where we help with writing and with design.
And they, of course, do it on your on your platform. So once you've built that that presentation, it lives on as long as they keep using your platform. The customers
No,
use your
no,
platform.
no, no. We actually built it in the platform of their choice, which
Oh,
meant
is that right? Wow.
doing work in PowerPoint, even though
Right.
we started against them.
Wow.
Um,
That must have been painful for the first few times you did that.
it was. But then what happened was, we recently did a deck for a Series B company, and then it sort of hit me like
By the way,
this.
when you say that, that was a little different from where you would normally start, right? You would typically start with startups, maybe seed, Series A. Is that right?
That's right. Most of our customers are seed stage,
Right.
for both the agency and the platform. But we did a deck for a Series B company called Upkeep.
Mm-hmm.
They raised some money recently, and we were very happy that we were involved. And like that's when we came to this conclusion. Like the CEO of Upkeep was not going. Like the reason he hired us was because he trusted our judgment. He wanted a well-designed deck, but he didn't have time to build it. So that's where the platform stops working. Like for these guys, they don't need, they have a staff of 50 people that somebody could build the deck for them. So it's not about automation. It's not about the platform. It's about an expert that helps them kind of craft their story. And we, late in the game, we discovered that this was something that we were good at, like at crafting these stories.
Right.
So it's a completely different business, a completely different structure of a business, certainly less scalable than the other one, but it sort of derived out of the audience that we had created.
Right. But it also doesn't mean that you've left your other business behind. You can continue to grow that. And this is really an adjunct to it, right?
Yeah. So it's still the same. It's all under the same umbrella. We tried actually separating those, but that didn't work out as well. So it's the same umbrella. It's just the fact that you can do the DIY option, and it's of course a lot cheaper, or you can do the experts option.
Absolutely. So we're talking about pitches, and when you look at putting a presentation together, the initial thing that all of us think about is it's about the pitch. It's the funding pitch. It's getting interest. It's getting somebody to write that check so you can move on to the next stage. Whenever I think about that, that's for me, the impetus to put your first presentation together, but then you find yourself using it for all sorts of other things, for recruiting, for sales, for business development. Maybe some of the slides are a little different. When I'm using PowerPoint, for example, just to use it as an example, the hide unhide button is really important, right? You move slides around, just to use that as a metaphor. So it's putting that basic story together. So can you share with us a little bit about what that story is when an entrepreneur needs, especially both from the product side, but also the agency side, when an entrepreneur is telling a story about their business? You help them tell that story, but what does that underlying story really need to be? What do you look for to be able to help start with a compelling story?
I think it's sometimes hard, right, to summarize your whole business story in 15 slides. Yeah. And people struggle with that a lot more than we expected. We thought that by separating content design, we would solve that, but no, like there's an extra variable to it, which is, how do you summarize that? Usually a well-designed deck, you see, people love our references to Airbnb and to the early Uber decks. Right. These are complex.
And in those instances, you actually redo those decks, right? You'll show us how you would redo those decks with a couple of great videos you've done.
But for those decks, we don't touch the content. I think that the content of those decks is fantastic. It's the golden standard for all of us. We did the design because it was a little outdated. But on the content side, the problem statement is 3 lines. How can you summarize this idea, concept that you have in just 3 problem statement lines? It's very hard. It's usually very hard. And I see a lot of entrepreneurs struggle with that. So normally they come to us with an attempt at a deck that's usually very long. Sometimes they come up to us with a business plan, which I'm not a big fan of business plans, but it's like the long form version of this. Right. And how do you abstract like the essence of this company and put it in 15 slides? These are the 15 slides that you send to an investor to get a meeting. So it needs to, everything about the company needs to be in there, but at the same time, only a small selection of words.
So one of the things that I see much of the same thing too, you and I have both heard Mark Twain's famous expression, I was going to write you a short letter, but I didn't have time. So I wrote you a long one instead, right?
That's right.
Condensing it down so you just get to the essence is really hard. One of the things that's interesting is every entrepreneur thinks their business is special and different, so the rules don't apply to them in many instances. But when you're pitching, investors are used to seeing information typically packaged in certain ways. So how important is that? You know, you just said that it's 15 slides. Some people say it's 10 slides or 12 slides. I mean, yes, you've got some flexibility around that, but there are certain things that investors are conditioned to seeing in a typical pitch, right? So there's kind of a cadence to a pitch around that. Can you just share a little bit about, you know, as you think about that, is there a single cadence? Should people pull different areas of their presentation forward because those are their strengths? What kind of advice do you give people as they think about that? And even as you've started to automate that through AI?
I think it's all about the storytelling, and I have this odd background because I originally studied digital animation, which is a cool career because it includes some screenwriting classes and some film appreciation stuff. And in the end, I think that, you know, a good presentation usually is told as a story, as like, well, this is a problem that I found. This is how I'm thinking that we could solve it. You know, these are some bumps that I came across along the road, and those are your plot twists, if you will. And you know, this combination of the flow of this story is honestly not that hard. Like this pitch deck structure that everybody talks about, in the end, is a story, right? It's a problem, it's a solution, it's a business model, it's the story of the team that can solve it. You know, you're building this story up until the point where you need to ask for money.
Right.
So you know, putting those telling that story in the right order can make a ton of a difference in whether somebody gets excited about it or not. And rules are made to be broken. Like, you know, sometimes I see decks and I recommend founders to start the deck with attraction. If they're doing really well, lead with that and then build your credibility early on. But it's about kind of understanding that, like summarizing the business, putting it in the right structure. And that's what, you know, that's what we help them do when they couldn't figure it out themselves.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I know sometimes I have entrepreneurs that kind of want to wait till the end of their presentation for the big reveal, kind of, especially the creative types. And it's like, no, as investors, you want to know right up front what's coming, right? Let us know what you're going to tell us and then lay it out. It's always great to start with a hook, though. That's what you were saying. If you have great traction, start with traction. If you have an amazing team that's had success in some key areas before, or can bring a lot of notoriety or attention, start with that. If you have some amazing technologies or patents that are protected, you might start with that. And of course, you always want to make sure that embedded wherever you start is with the problem that you're trying to help people solve. So I think when you said rules are made to be broken, a lot of it is the typical "it depends" answer, and it depends on what do you have that's special. Because ultimately, I think if investors are going to invest in you, you have to show them it's a special solution, it's a special team, it's a special product, it's a special whatever, or people love what you're doing, right? That's the traction piece.
Yeah, and one of the, you know, one of the lessons that we've learned, and it's a lesson that I learned and that I sort of try to transmit into our customers, even though it's not great for business, our business, is, you know, when is the right time to raise money? I think that a lot of the whole, and it happened to me the first time, and one of the reasons I think why our company failed, first company, was there's this whole thing built around, oh, do you have a product idea? Okay, go and find an investor, go and raise money.
Right.
And I had to learn the hard way that that's not the way it goes. We did 500 startups with Slidebean back in 2015. And one of the first lessons that I got here was, like, we assumed that by getting into 500 startups, we'd get in front of investors, we'd have the credibility of, hey, these guys were funded by 500 startups, this big famous accelerator. And first day in the office, they asked for a show of hands, like which companies are looking to raise money during the winter, which was the batch. I showed my hand, and then they all asked, okay, so what's your traction? How much revenue are you making? What are your unit economics? And to half of us, they said, guys, don't bother raising money. Like, don't bother going to investors now. Which was it was against everything I had learned for the past 3 years on, you have a product, go raise money. No, what they said was, no, you need traction, you need revenue, you need to be growing really fast, and that's when you go look for investors. So we tried to translate this message into our own customers. By the time they're customers, they're already too late. Like, they already paid us to build their deck.
Right.
But it's about setting the right expectations also, and helping them guide through this early stage company journey.
Yeah, I think that there's still is out there. I mean, it's changed since you first started, and the Y Combinators and 500 startups. You get into there with a good idea and a good team. Sometimes it requires some traction, but beyond that, I think it's really important. It used to be in the old days, and definitely I've qualified. I've raised money in the old days, and I've launched businesses in the old days. A good idea, a good team, you could go out and actually raise capital, because to be able to create something would take a lot of time. You would have to buy servers, things like that
That's
we don't
right.
even think about now.
That's right.
You would have to
Yes.
write a bunch of code. There weren't all of these other components that you could borrow pieces of, stitch them together, and create an early prototype really fast and see what works.
That's right.
But
That's right.
you don't have to do that. So
yeah.
good founding teams, and then right back to you, good founding teams pretty quickly should be able to mock something up and go see if people are actually going to use it and buy it. And I think, to your point, a lot of people still think the old fashioned way, but what are investors looking for? And then whatever else you were going to add too.
That's right. So that's the first part. I mean, unless it's an exception of a business, maybe hardware is probably one of those exceptions,
Right.
but for the most part on software, you should be able to go to an investor with something that's built. We before we started the recording, we talked a little bit about mistakes, and one of the biggest mistakes I see is a business founder, no co-founders, who's looking to build a tech product. So they're going to investors to get money to hire their CTO.
Right.
So my take here, and we see that a lot, even in our customers. So my take for them is this is the wrong way to go. Why? Because if you're building, if you're building a biotech company, then the scientist should be a co-founder. They shouldn't be an employee. They shouldn't come after the money. They should be the founder, right? So the same way goes for a tech company. If you're building a website or an app, the person who's building that should be one of the founders.
Yeah, absolutely. I run into that. I mean, especially say in business schools where we have a great idea, we validated the demand, we need to raise some money so we can go hire our tech team. And the answer is no, you've got to find the tech team first, because as an investor, I'm not going to invest in you until I know you actually have that committed founding team and that this team can start to execute. Because that's one of the risk factors as an investor I always look for. It's team, but it's execution risk, right? Can you actually build what you think you need to build?
That's right. And the if you have the tech co-founder, like you can start building a product. They can work at night. They can work
Right.
part-time on the product. And that's why sort of that expectation has changed, where you're expected to come with a prototype to that meeting.
Yeah, so we're not going to touch on that, but the ability to rapid prototype, the ability to get something out, I mean, that's increasingly a prerequisite to anything beyond the friends and family and founder, your Fs, that you might be putting in. All right, cool. Help us with, think to some of the mistakes and some of the successes that you've seen, both for you as a CEO and founder and pitcher, but also for so many of the clients that you've worked with, both on the Slidebean side, but also on the agency side. And I was wondering if you might be able to share, we're going to start with kind of things that work. And then I'm going to ask you one or two key mistakes that you've seen or frequent mistakes. But if there are 2 or 3 things that successful founders and pitchers, in particular, people who are putting that presentation and delivering that presentation together, what are some of the key things that they do? And I think we've touched on a few so far, but I just want to kind of really highlight those.
Yeah, I think a good balance of, to me, those first 3 slides, we call internally, we call them the problem solution combination. Those are probably the most critical slides, and sometimes they've solved it. Sometimes they're a little too long, but when they solved it, it's usually an indication that the rest of the deck is going to go in the right direction.
So expand on that just a little bit, right? Because that's so important what you just said.
So solving them to me is making sure that you can talk about the real problem, the real pain point that you've identified, a very tangible pain point in a specific audience, and that you have a solution that can monetize that pain point by offering a better option. That's the premise of the business, right? Like that's the even that problem statement and the audience that experiences that pain point, it's even an introduction to how big the company can be, right? Because it's the market size.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a company, maybe it's a problem that's too small that only happens in a, that's been solved elsewhere in the world, and that immediately makes your market smaller because you're only solving it for a small percentage of people.
Yeah. So you start with no, as an entrepreneur, you start with really a hypothesis, and maybe it's a problem that I've encountered, but here's a problem. Then to your point, you have to actually demonstrate that it's a problem that a lot of people have, enough people have to launch a product, right? So this is where you might want to share even some of your customer discovery insights, some of the interviews, some of the, and who's actually using your product. And then on the solution side, what more do you want to share about the solution? Why it's special, what it is, how it works? What do you do early on?
Yeah. Also, the solution is your thesis on how you plan to solve this.
Right.
Ideally, that should, in the ideal world, in the ideal deck, that should come with screenshots immediately as like, this is how it looks. This is what we're doing. One other, I'm getting a little bit out of topic here, but it's also one of the big successes that we see in decks is when a deck has a great go-to-market plan. People underestimate a lot of people don't even understand what go-to-market means. What people expect to see, what investors expect to see in that part of the deck is who are your customers and how are you getting to them? Are you doing sales, or are you doing marketing? How much can you afford to spend to acquire one of these guys?
What's that right?
What's your angle?
Yeah, what's that right kind of balance between high-level strategy and granularity on what's your cost to acquire a customer, or how much is that customer worth as you kind of think about that go-to-market and your metrics? Where do you try and help people balance on that?
At the early stage, those numbers are very relevant, but in the Series A, Series B decks that we've worked on, we make sure to emphasize them a lot, because that's the backbone of the business, right? Your unit economics. Yeah. In the early stages, it's not that important. I remember our early stage decks had a lot of stuff on virality, on metrics, on how many exposures was one presentation created on Slidebean getting, because at that point, our go-to-market plan was people will be exposed to great decks via Slidebean, and then that's going to create some traction for us. Yeah. We were wrong. Terribly wrong about that, but I think that deck did get us, that deck got us into 500 startups, for example. And the reason it did, it was not because the go-to-market plan was the correct one. It was mostly because we understood what we were doing. We were, we had a goal in mind, and we were very familiar with the KPIs around that goal. Yeah.
So, let's go to the other side of that. So those are some things that you really look for from a successful pitch. What about some mistakes that entrepreneurs frequently make, especially kind of entrepreneurs who haven't done this a lot when it comes to putting a pitch or a presentation together?
Probably the biggest one a missing go-to-market slide is one. A market size estimation that's just too. And I've been a victim of this myself. Like, I've done it wrong many times. But when you think of market slide, what's the market size? And the immediate thing you go is, well, presentation market size, Google. And then you'll see like, oh, whatever billion number. And you can do that for pretty much any industry.
Right.
And that is the wrong approach. Your approach should be, the question that the market size slide is trying to answer is, how big does this company get? Which means, how much revenue can it make? Which means, how many customers does it have? How many customers are there in the world? And that's the market size
exactly
question.
So no, and meanwhile, as an investor, the investor is doing the math, saying, if I invest $1 million now and this company actually hits this, how much can I get back out? What does this company become worth? So that's why it's so important to them. Regardless of how smart you are, how good you are, whatever else it is, the investor is looking to figure out, can I get a 10x on this investment, especially if they're, or more, especially if they're an early stage investor. So that's, to your point, if you don't have that slide, the investor can't do that math, and maybe they don't even take you to the next step.
Yeah, and that math is often miscalculated when you say, it was miscalculated for us when we said, well, our market, who's our market? Well, anybody who's building presentations is our market. Right. Wrong. Now it's, well, seed and Series A companies that are looking to raise money in the next year. That's our market. They're the ones that could use the products and services that we offer. So how many of them are there? Okay, that's a much more finite number. The last mistake that I see.
Yeah, but once you define that, then you can figure out how to reach those people, not everybody in the world doing presentations, right? And that's what, as an investor, I would look for and say, oh, now I understand. And if your go-to-market hits that in a good way, then I say, you guys understand who your customer is and how to reach them. And for me,
so that's another slide combination, which is the market and the go-to-market, which is,
right.
Okay, who are the customers? Show me that you understand who they are and that you're going after a niche, that you're starting somewhere. And then show me how you're going to sell to them.
Yeah. All right. So the last question that I have for you, which kind of leads into kind of where we want to lead this, is you created a reasonably unique, maybe not incredibly unique, but a really interesting go-to-market strategy that features you. Tell us about that, right? How did you get there? The videos that you create, they have a certain style about them. They have a cadence about them. They talk about your product, and they definitely empathize with the early stage entrepreneur. How did you get there, and how do they work? How well do they work?
Yeah, it's definitely a double-edged sword, because if I'm the one that's in front of the camera selling this product, selling this company is harder, because then they're still going to need me if I'm that big part of our go-to-market. Not planned at all. Like, I never intended to be the face of the company in the way I am now. It started with, once we discovered this audience, which was startups, we figured out, well, how else are we going to sell to them? We started with Google Ads, and then we would target the keyword pitch deck, but we depleted that channel very fast, because when you have the right economics, you say, well, I'm spending $10,000 on AdWords this month, but I'm making 20 because the conversion rate is working. Well, I'll just spend 20 next month, and you can start scaling that very quickly. But eventually, there are just no more searches for that, and we found that point pretty fast. So then we moved into SEO.
Or you start paying too much for the searches, at which point your cost of acquisition is too great. Yeah.
So the next step is, well, how else can we get these to these people? So our next big project, this was like a year project, was SEO. So we're like, well, they're already searching for this stuff. We're showing up in the ads, but not in the organic results. So how do we do that? Well, that required a blog and a lot of articles and a lot of content around pitch decks, which I wrote myself for the most part. I did 2-3 articles per week back then. But we sort of established ourselves as a reference and a reference for Google, really, so that we would show up first. But then that ran out as well, because we were ranking number 1 to 3 in the searches that we really wanted to rank. So what comes next? And that's when we set our eyes on YouTube. We failed many times at YouTube. In the end, every marketing tactic, we experiment, we deploy a little bit of a budget and wait and see what happens. And with YouTube, we did this many times and many times failed. We could have easily stopped trying.
So for those who don't know, what's your YouTube strategy?
So the first YouTube strategy was, we tried a bunch of things. Content. We did a sitcom on stuff that happened in the office. That didn't work out. I did interviews, which didn't work out. I did kind of like these little opinion videos on stuff around design. That didn't work out. And finally, the thing that worked out was targeting the same searches that we were targeting on Google. We would target them on YouTube. So searches around fundraising, around pitch decks, around how to build a deck, and how a convertible note works. And we made really good videos about that. Like we'd find other videos around the same topics, figure out if they were not great, and we're like, we need to bring it one step up, and then we can be the video on YouTube about this topic. That was the original strategy, and that worked. And eventually, it got us an audience that was large enough so that we could start publishing whatever content we wanted. That was useful, of course, and they'd still watch it and they'd still enjoy it, and it would still drive people down the funnel.
So what's interesting is when you look at it now in hindsight, you go, it was so obvious. We should just talk about what we know. But when you're entering a new marketplace and you don't have all of that necessarily lined up, you go through a lot of experiments to see what sticks. So you have a whole series of videos now that are all around how you put together great pitch decks, how you do a great job on presenting, those types of things. And I expect as you expand the scope of what you're doing at Slidebean, those videos are going to continue to evolve on topics too. Is that right?
Yeah, and one thing with content marketing though is that content marketing is very expensive, right? The blog was as a very expensive project for us back then. YouTube is a very expensive project. We do all this stuff in house. We built a team around it, and that's why it ends up being cheaper.
Right.
But producing one of these videos could easily cost $3,000-4,000 per video.
Right.
It's a very expensive tactic, and a lot of people go to content marketing first, and it ends up driving them out of business because content marketing takes time to kick in, and there's trial and error. And if those trial errors are very expensive, then you just don't have the money to do it. With YouTube, we got lucky because we were able to build it cheaper. I edited and did the post-production for the first few videos myself. So we always did it very lean, and it was only after we found some success that we actually allowed ourselves to deploy more budget. But yeah, like that's the danger with content marketing, that it takes time to kick in, and that you have to be very clear about which audience this targets. We've done videos about graphic design on YouTube, and they do terribly because that's not our audience. They're
Right.
they're not watching us because we're good at design, we think. They're watching us because we're sharing insights about the startup journey that they probably can't get anywhere else. And that's probably the last piece of the puzzle. We've allowed ourselves to be a little transparent. For example, we released our 2015 financials, which is the year when we first raised money. They're public, and people appreciate this. They realize that we're trying to help and selling them at the same time, which is a very delicate balance.
Right. But you're being genuine about that, right? Yeah, exactly. You're being transparent and open. At the end of this video, I will post a few links to some of your videos. And from there, it's pretty easy to find the rest, right? You've got your content marketing in pretty full scope of offerings out there. Any final thoughts that you might want for kind of aspiring entrepreneurs, corporate entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs? We do all of that. Final thoughts on just telling your story, and then we'll wrap it up.
No, don't think of funding as a means to an end, right? You're building a business, and funding makes it easier. But the priority is building a business. When you're in the early stages, fundraising is a full-time job for the CEO. It is for 3 months. It's almost a full-time job in meetings and follow-ups and all of that. So you're carving yourself out of the business, which means that if you're a product CEO, your product's going to lag behind. Or if you're a sales hustler type CEO, your sales or your revenue are going to lag behind. So you're betting a potential slowdown on the business in exchange for raising money. And that's a bet that you need to be prepared to make, and you need to make sure that you're making that bet at the right time. With Slidebean, I tried to raise money before we had enough traction, and it was a big waste of 3 very expensive months for the company because we didn't have a lot of money.
Right.
And it included traveling and flights and all of that. So funding is not the goal. Funding helps, but make sure that you're only going at it at the right time.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great place to end it. When you're at that right inflection point, when the addition of some capital is going to enable you to really accelerate, that's the time to go seek your funding, not necessarily just to continue stretching the experimentation. I mean, I think that's embedded in what you're saying. And that's the point when you need to be able to tell your story really well. Caya, this was great. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for sharing your insights and your wisdom. And I know that many of the people that are watching this right now can go ahead. If they want to put a search term in and find your videos, what should they Google?
If they Google pitch deck, I think my face should show up.
Okay.
But Slidebean is the brand name, if you want to be sure.
Google pitch deck. If you don't find Caya yet, Google pitch deck, Caya, Caya, or Slidebean. For sure, you're going to find them. Caya, thanks so much.
Thanks so much for having me, Mark.